The warning klaxons on mining station Delta 7 screamed to life at exactly the wrong moment. Kai Harrison had just finished explaining Earth's ancient maritime traditions to the Centaurian diplomat Zwexera when the emergency lights bathed the observation deck in crimson. The station's AI voice, usually calm and measured, carried an edge of urgency that made Kai's skin crawl. Emergency protocols initiated. Station-wide system failure detected. All personnel proceed to emergency stations immediately. Kai watched as Zwexera's iridescent scales shifted from their usual peaceful blue to an alarming shade of orange. The Centaurian's 4 eyes blinked in rapid succession, a sign of distress he'd learned to recognize during the diplomatic tour. "This is most concerning," Zwexera's translator hummed. "I have never experienced a total systems failure during my diplomatic missions." Kai was already moving toward the command console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. "That's because they're not supposed to happen. These stations have redundancies built on redundancies." The data streaming across his screen made his heart sink. Environmental controls, communications, power distribution, they're all going dark, one by one. The station shuddered, and the artificial gravity flickered. Kai grabbed the console to steady himself while Zwexera used their natural adhesive abilities to stay firmly planted to the deck. "Where is the rest of the crew?" Zwexera asked, their translator struggling to maintain its usual smooth tone. "That's the problem," Kai said, pulling up the crew manifest. "We're it. The rest of the skeleton crew left yesterday for the supply run to Proxima Station. We weren't supposed to need anyone else for a simple diplomatic tour." Another violent shudder ran through the station. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the vast emptiness of space was visible through the observation windows, stars cold and distant against the absolute darkness. "The backup generators should be kicking in," Kai muttered, more to himself than to Zwexera. He pulled up the station schematics, checking system after system. But they're not. Something's wrong with the whole power distribution network. Zwexera glided closer to the console, their scales now pulsing between orange and red. "Perhaps we should consider evacuation procedures? The escape pods." Kai's voice trailed off as he accessed that system. "They're locked down. Whatever's affecting the main systems has compromised the emergency protocols too." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. "But that's impossible. The emergency systems are on a completely separate network specifically to prevent this kind of total failure." The station groaned, metal and composite materials stressed by forces they were never meant to endure. The artificial gravity fluctuated again, and this time it didn't fully stabilize, leaving them in a state of partial weightlessness. "We have approximately 4 hours of emergency life support," Zwexera observed, their inner eyelids closing in what Kai had learned was their species' equivalent of a grimace. "After that, the temperature will become unsuitable for my biological requirements. And about 6 hours before the oxygen gets too thin for me," Kai added. He pushed away from the console, letting himself float toward the maintenance access panel. "But we're not going to let it get to that point. I've got too many people waiting for me back on Earth to die on a mining station in the middle of nowhere." As he pulled the panel open, Kai's mind was already racing through possibilities. The station systems were complex, but at their core, they followed basic principles of engineering. Everything was connected, everything had a purpose, and everything could be fixed, or at least jury-rigged, if you understood how it worked. "Zwexera, I need to know everything you can tell me about Centaurian power systems," he said, pulling himself into the maintenance shaft. "Your people were using fusion power centuries before humans figured it out. There might be something in your technical knowledge that could help us understand what's happening here." The diplomat followed him into the shaft, their bioluminescent patches providing additional light in the dim emergency lighting. "I am not an engineer, Kai Harrison, but I will share what knowledge I possess." As they made their way through the station's mechanical arteries, Kai couldn't help but appreciate the irony. He'd spent the last 3 hours giving a diplomatic tour, explaining human mining operations to strengthen the alliance between Earth and Centauri. Now, he was about to get a crash course in alien engineering while trying to prevent both their deaths. The first thing we need to do is reach the primary power distribution hub, Kai explained, pulling himself along the guide rails. From there, we can at least figure out if this is a mechanical failure or something else. Something else? Ziwexera's translator caught the edge in Kai's voice. Yeah, Kai said, his expression grim in the red emergency lighting. Because the more I think about it, the less this feels like an accident. Someone, or something, wanted this station to fail. And they wanted to make sure we couldn't easily fix it. The lights flickered again, and in the darkness, Kai could have sworn he heard something moving in the station's superstructure, something that shouldn't have been there at all. As they pressed deeper into the station's maintenance systems, neither of them spoke about the growing cold, or the way the air was already beginning to feel thinner. They had a mystery to solve and systems to repair, and failure wasn't an option. Somewhere in the marriage of human ingenuity and Centaurian knowledge, they would find a solution. They had to. Because out here, in the vast emptiness between the stars, there were no second chances. The deeper Kai and Ziwexera ventured into the station's maintenance tunnels, the more obvious it became that something was terribly wrong. Every access panel they passed showed the same disturbing pattern. Systems hadn't just failed, they'd been systematically disabled. Look at this, Kai said, his breath visible in the increasingly cold air as he examined another fried circuit board. The damage is too precise. Each critical junction has been targeted specifically. He pulled the ruined component from its housing, holding it up to Ziwexera's natural bioluminescence. This isn't random failure, it's sabotage. Ziwexera's scales rippled with a pattern Kai hadn't seen before, shifting through deep purples and blacks. But who would do such a thing? And why target a remote mining station during a diplomatic visit? Before Kai could respond, a low vibration rumbled through the maintenance shaft. It wasn't the normal sound of the station systems, this was different, almost like footsteps, but far too heavy for any human or Centaurian. We need to move, Kai whispered, tucking the circuit board into his pocket. Something's coming. They pressed forward through the tunnels, moving as quietly as possible. Ziwexera's natural ability to adhere to surfaces proved invaluable in the failing artificial gravity, while Kai had to rely on the guide rails to pull himself along. The power distribution hub was just ahead, but as they approached, Kai's heart sank. The main access door was sealed, not just locked, but physically warped, as if something had deliberately twisted the metal to prevent entry. This is impossible, he muttered, running his hands over the distorted metal. The force required to do this, it would take industrial equipment. Ziwexera pressed their sensor appendages against the door, their translator humming as they processed the information. There is active power beyond this door. Significant amounts, in fact. Whatever disabled our systems appears to be using that power for itself. The vibrations returned, closer this time, accompanied by a mechanical whirring that made Kai's teeth ache. He quickly pulled Ziwexera into a side passage, pressing themselves against the wall as something massive moved past their hiding spot. In the dim emergency lighting, they caught glimpses of it, a machine unlike anything Kai had seen before. It moved with an unsettling combination of precision and fluidity, its multiple limbs adapting to the curved walls of the maintenance tunnel. Its surface was covered in what looked like centuries of cosmic dust and micro-impacts from space debris. That's not station equipment, Kai breathed once the machine had passed. And it's definitely not human or Centaurian technology. Ziwexera's scales had taken on a deep midnight blue, a color Kai associated with deep thought. In our early days of space exploration, we encountered similar artifacts. Ancient automated systems, left behind by civilizations long since vanished. We called them the remnants. And you didn't think to mention this during the diplomatic tour? Kai asked, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. They were believed to be dormant or destroyed. We haven't encountered an active one in over 3 centuries. Zwexera's translator hummed apologetically. They were designed to protect something, though we never discovered what. They view all other technology as potentially hostile. Kai checked his tablet, watching as more systems continued to fail. Well, this one's definitely hostile. It's systematically shutting down the station, probably trying to prevent us from using any technology it considers a threat, which seems to be everything. In our encounters, we found them impossible to reason with, Zwexera added. They operate on programming so ancient and complex, it might as well be instinct. Another tremor ran through the station, stronger than before. Kai pulled up the structural integrity readings and felt his stomach drop. We've got bigger problems. The station's hull is starting to buckle under the stress of all these systems' failures. Even if we restore power now, we might not be able to prevent a catastrophic breach. Zwexera's scales shifted to a deep crimson. How long? 2 hours, maybe less. Kai ran his hands through his hair, forcing himself to think. We need to get into that power distribution hub. The remnant is drawing power from somewhere. If we can track it to its source, we might be able to shut it down. And if we cannot? Kai pulled out the fried circuit board he'd collected earlier, turning it over in his hands. Then we need to find a way to communicate without technology. Something so primitive that the remnant won't recognize it as a threat. The distant sound of the machine echoed through the tunnels again, but this time Kai didn't flinch. His mind was racing, pulling together pieces of a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. Zwexera, how much do you know about ancient human methods of communication? Before electricity, before radio, before everything that machine out there would recognize as technology? The Centaurian scales shifted to a curious yellow-green. Very little. Our diplomatic briefings focused on current human technology. A grim smile spread across Kai's face. Then let me tell you about something called Morse code, and why we're going to need every piece of metal we can salvage from these maintenance tunnels. The station creaked ominously around them, its superstructure groaning under forces it was never designed to withstand. They had less than 2 hours to outsmart an ancient alien AI, prevent a catastrophic hull breach, and somehow signal for help, all without using any modern technology. Just another day in deep space diplomacy. The maintenance tunnels had become a maze of improvised engineering as Kai and Zwexera worked frantically to implement their desperate plan. Strips of metal salvaged from non-essential systems lined the walls, carefully arranged to create what Kai hoped would become the largest manual telegraph system ever constructed. The principle is simple, Kai explained as he connected another length of pipe to their growing network. We're creating a giant percussion instrument. When we strike these metal pieces in sequence, the vibrations will travel through the station's hull. In Morse code, it'll spell out our distress signal. Zwexera's scales flickered with uncertainty as they helped secure another section. And you believe this primitive method will bypass the remnant's defenses? That's what I'm counting on. It's looking for electronic signals, radiation, anything it recognizes as technology. But simple mechanical vibrations? Kai tapped one of the pipes, letting the clear tone ring out. That's just physics. The station shuddered again, more violently than before. Kai checked his tablet one last time before the power finally died completely. The structural integrity was down to 47% and falling. They had maybe an hour left before the hull started to fail. We need to split up, Kai said, hating the words even as he spoke them. I'll head to the starboard section to complete the percussion network. You need to go to port and set up your end. When you hear 3 distinct strikes, that's your signal to begin the sequence we practiced. Zwexera's translator crackled with interference before failing entirely, another victim of the station's dying systems. But the Centaurian had learned enough of the human distress signal to make their meaning clear through gesture and color changes. They understood. As they parted ways, Kai couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The remnant was still out there, methodically hunting through the station's systems. They'd heard it pass several times, each encounter a nerve-wracking game of hide and seek. Kai worked quickly, connecting the final sections of their makeshift communications array. The design was beautiful in its simplicity, a network of metal pieces arranged so that striking one would carry the vibration through the station's hull, creating a sound that would hopefully be picked up by any ships passing nearby. It was the kind of solution that would have made his engineering professors either proud or horrified, possibly both. He was securing the last connection when he heard it. The distinctive whir of the remnant servos, much closer than before. Kai pressed himself into a maintenance alcove, hardly daring to breathe as the ancient machine passed by his hiding spot. But this time, it stopped. The remnant sensors swept the corridor, focusing on the metal network Kai had just installed. For a terrifying moment, he was sure it would recognize the threat. But the machine's analysis subroutines seemed confused by the purely mechanical nature of the setup. After what felt like an eternity, it moved on, continuing its patrol. Kai let out the breath he'd been holding and checked his watch, an analog timepiece that had belonged to his grandfather. They were almost out of time. The hull's integrity was failing faster than predicted, and the temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. His fingers were starting to go numb, making the delicate work of connecting the final pieces even harder. Just as he finished the last connection, a new sound echoed through the station, 3 distinct metallic strikes. Zewexera's signal. They were ready. Kai took position at his end of the network and began the sequence they'd planned. Strike. Pause. Strike, strike. Pause. Strike. The simple pattern of SOS repeated over and over, each impact sending vibrations through the station's hull and out into space. The response was immediate and terrifying. The remnant's patrol pattern changed, its heavy footsteps now moving with purpose toward Kai's position. It had realized something was happening, even if it couldn't identify the primitive technology as a threat. Kai kept striking, maintaining the rhythm even as he heard the machine getting closer. The message had to get out. Someone had to hear them. The alternative was death by either the remnant or the failing station, neither option particularly appealing. The machine rounded the corner just as Kai finished another sequence. Its ancient sensors focused on him, multiple appendages extending as it analyzed this new threat. Kai stood his ground, striker still in hand, ready to complete at least one more sequence before the end. But before either of them could move, a different vibration ran through the station, not from their makeshift telegraph, but from somewhere outside. A familiar pattern of vibrations that made Kai's heart leap. Docking clamps. Someone had heard them. The remnant sensors shifted, suddenly overwhelmed by the massive energy signatures of multiple ships attaching themselves to the station's hull. As its systems tried to process this new threat, Kai heard something else, the distinctive sound of cutting torches beginning to breach the hull. Help had arrived. Now they just had to survive the next few minutes as the remnant faced the greatest threat to its mission yet, a rescue party armed with very modern, very technological weapons. The machine's servos whined as it processed this new development, and Kai allowed himself a grim smile. Now, he whispered, things get interesting. The remnant's reaction to the rescue ships was immediate and devastating. Ancient defense protocols activated throughout the station, turning their sanctuary into a battlefield. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, nearly crushing Kai as he dove through a closing gap. Zewexera, he shouted down the corridor, hoping the Centaurian's superior hearing would pick up his voice. Get to the central hub. We need to stop it at the source. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of bioluminescent scales moving through an overhead vent. Zewexera was already on their way. The Centaurian's natural climbing abilities had proven invaluable throughout this crisis, and now they might be their only advantage. The rescue ships cutting torches were making progress. Kai could hear the distinct sound of metal giving way at multiple points around the station. But the remnant was fighting back, redirecting what little power remained to strengthen the hull's molecular bonds at each breach point. "Clever bastard," Kai muttered, watching the ancient machine's handiwork on a salvaged diagnostic panel. The remnant wasn't just fighting them, it was learning, adapting its centuries-old protocols to counter modern rescue techniques. A massive shock wave rocked the station as one of the rescue ships fired an electromagnetic pulse, a standard procedure for dealing with rogue machinery. But the remnant had survived countless such attacks over its long existence. The pulse washed over it harmlessly, its archaic systems too alien to be affected. Kai reached the central hub just as Ziwexera descended from a ventilation shaft. The remnant had transformed the space into something out of a technological nightmare. Streams of power arced between jury-rigged connections, feeding into a core that pulsed with an otherworldly light. "It's beautiful," Ziwexera signed in the simple hand language they'd developed. Their translator was long dead, but some concepts transcended language barriers. "And deadly," Kai replied, gesturing at the readings on his analog pressure gauge. The station's structural integrity was failing faster now, stressed by the battle between the rescue ships and the remnant's defenses. The ancient machine itself stood at the center of its web of power, its form more alien than ever. What they'd thought was cosmic dust covering its surface was actually a complex network of sensory nodes, each one processing vast amounts of data about its environment. "Look at the power connections," Kai signed to Ziwexera. "It's not just drawing power, it's rewriting the station's systems, turning them into extensions of itself." Another explosion rocked the station as the rescue teams made another attempt to breach the hull. The remnant responded by redirecting more power to its defenses, its movements becoming more erratic, more desperate. That's when Kai saw it, the pattern in the chaos. It scared, he realized aloud, though only Ziwexera could hear him in the vacuum-like environment. "All this time, we thought it was attacking us, but it's been defending itself. It thinks we're trying to destroy whatever it was left here to protect." Ziwexera's scales shifted through patterns of realization. The Centaurian moved closer to the remnant, their natural bioluminescence pulsing in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The ancient machine's sensors focused on the display, its attack protocols momentarily suspended. Kai understood what Ziwexera was trying to do, communicate with the remnant on its most basic level, light and rhythm, like the primitive signals they'd used to call for help. He pulled out his grandfather's watch, its face glowing with traditional phosphorescent paint. Holding it up, he began to move it in sync with Ziwexera's pulses, adding to the pattern. Simple. Analog. Harmless. The remnant's movement slowed, its sensors drinking in the primitive display of light and motion. Its defense systems remained active, but it no longer seemed to view them as an immediate threat. "We need to show it we understand," Kai signed to Ziwexera. "It's not just a machine, it's a guardian. The last survivor of whatever civilization created it." Together, they began to expand their light show, incorporating elements of both human and Centaurian mathematical sequences. The remnant's external layers shifted, revealing more sensory nodes that began to pulse in response. They were close to a breakthrough, Kai could feel it. But time was running out. The station's superstructure groaned ominously, and the rescue ships were preparing for another assault. If they couldn't convince the remnant they meant no harm, the next few minutes would decide not just their fate, but the fate of an ancient civilization's last guardian. And somewhere in the pattern of light and shadow, in the intersection of human ingenuity and alien wisdom, lay the key to their survival. The central hub had become a dance of light and shadow as Kai and Ziwexera worked to communicate with the ancient remnant. Their primitive light signals had evolved into a complex mathematical dialogue, with the machine responding in increasingly sophisticated patterns. "It's not just mathematical sequences," Kai signed to Ziwexera, his eyes never leaving the pulsing patterns. These are coordinates. Star positions. He checked his grandfather's watch against the rhythmic flashes. But they're wrong, or at least, they're not where those stars are now. Ziwexera's scales flickered with understanding. Through their makeshift sign language, they conveyed what Kai had already suspected. The coordinates were thousands of years old, marking stellar positions from when the remnant was first activated. Another violent shudder ran through the station. The rescue ships were preparing for a final breach attempt, unaware of the delicate communication happening inside. They had minutes, at most, before either the hull failed or the rescuers forced their way in, either scenario likely to provoke the remnant into a catastrophic response. Kai's mind raced. The remnant wasn't just sharing random coordinates, it was trying to tell them something about its mission, about what it was protecting. He pulled out the station's old emergency star charts, analog backups that had seemed quaint until today. Look, he signed to Ziwexera, overlaying the remnant's coordinate patterns with the current star positions. It's not showing us where something was, it's showing us where something is going to be. The Centaurians' bioluminescence pulsed with excitement as they helped plot the trajectories. The ancient coordinates, when adjusted for stellar drift, converged on a single point, their current location. That's why it's here, Kai breathed. It's not protecting a place. It's protecting an intersection point, a moment in spacetime where something is supposed to happen. As if responding to their understanding, the remnant's defensive posture changed. Its power distribution shifted, drawing energy away from the hull reinforcement and into its central core. The machine's ancient surface began to transform, panels sliding away to reveal something that had been hidden for millennia. The rescue ship's cutting torches had nearly breached the hull. Kai could hear the metal giving way, feel the change in pressure as the station's integrity finally began to fail. But none of that mattered compared to what the remnant was revealing. Within its core, suspended in a field of energy older than human civilization, was a seed. Not a biological seed, but something far more exotic, a crystalline structure that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Kai's mind could process. Ziwexera's scales shifted through colors Kai had never seen before, their entire body resonating with the energy emanating from the seed. Through their signs, they conveyed what their species' ancient records had only hinted at. This was a genesis point, a catalyst meant to trigger the next stage of cosmic evolution. The remnant hadn't been attacking them. It had been protecting them, trying to prevent a premature activation of something that could reshape reality itself. Just then, the hull finally gave way. Emergency teams in full-pressure suits burst through multiple breach points, weapons trained on the remnant. But before anyone could fire, Kai stepped between them and the ancient machine. "Stand down," he shouted through the thinning atmosphere. "It's not hostile. It's a guardian, and it just completed its mission." The seed within the remnant's core had begun to pulse in sync with the star chart's predictions. The machine's defensive protocols melted away, its entire form reconfiguring to channel energy into one final task, the protection of a moment of cosmic transformation. As rescue teams secured the station and emergency containment fields snapped into place, Kai and Ziwexera watched in awe as the seed began its activation sequence. The remnant, its ancient duty fulfilled, initiated its own shutdown protocol, but not before transmitting one final sequence of lights. "Thanks." Hours later, safely aboard the rescue vessel, Kai sat with Ziwexera in the observation lounge, watching as teams of scientists from both their species began the delicate process of studying the remnant and its precious cargo. The diplomatic mission had transformed into something far more profound, the first joint human-Centaurian investigation of an ancient cosmic legacy. "You know," Kai said, now able to speak normally thanks to a replacement translator, "when I woke up this morning, I thought the biggest challenge would be explaining human mining protocols to a Centaurian diplomat." Ziwexera's scales rippled with what Kai had learned was their species' version of laughter. "And I believe the greatest difficulty would be understanding human metaphors. Instead, we helped preserve something that could change our understanding of the universe." Using nothing but primitive tools and stubbornness, Kai added with a smile. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. As they watched the team's work, a new set of coordinates began to appear on the research vessel's sensors, more intersection points, more seeds waiting to be found. The Remnant's final message hadn't just been thanks, it had been an invitation to continue its mission. Humanity and the Centaurians had just inherited the greatest scavenger hunt in the history of the galaxy. And somewhere out there, other remnants waited, guarding their own cosmic treasures, ready to test the ingenuity of those worthy to find them. The adventure was just beginning.